Hello, good morning. Hi everyone, my name is Bob White. I'm the production manager here at Sydney Living Museums, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this morning to the Museum of Sydney for the Walter Burley Griffin Society lecture. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here to the Museum of Sydney this morning on what would have been Marion's 150th birthday. I know that's a very special occasion. Looking forward to hearing from Anne about what would have made Marion's hair stand on end. So I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Anne Watson on the Paradise on Earth exhibition, which is on display upstairs. We worked together over the past 12 months and a little bit more developing the exhibition, and it was really joyful to work with Anne and learn more about Marion, to understand more about her philosophies, her artistry and her talent, and in particular her work with Walter and their legacy in terms of Castle Crag and the community of Castle Crag. So I think it's fair to say that the exhibition we put on is not quite what we'd planned. COVID has had an impact on so many aspects of our lives, and the Paradise on Earth exhibition was another project that came under some challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic. The museum was forced to close, our exhibition program was put into a bit of disarray, and we were working right up until a week before install, not being quite sure if some of our loans from Victoria were even going to make it across the border. So we're really pleased that we were able to put together the exhibition. It's a condensed version of what we'd hoped to put on display, but it's still a significant and important exhibition to celebrate Marion and her legacy, and it was wonderful testament to Anne that we managed to put that show together. So I hope you all take the time after the lecture to enjoy that exhibition upstairs. One thing you won't be able to experience is the film series that we put together, because that is normally playing here in this lecture, so in this lecture theatre. But they are available online. So when you go home after the lecture, please do take the time, and you can learn more about Marion, and in particular hear from people who are living in Castle Crag and enjoying that suburb. So enjoy the lecture today. I'm going to hand over to Archie, who is the president of the Walter Burley Griffin Society, to introduce Anne and the lecture today. So thank you very much for coming to the Museum of Sydney this morning.
Thank you, Bob. Where are you? Oh, thanks for the introduction. And good morning. It's absolutely lovely to see you all here on this day, the birthday of Marion Mahony Griffin, and not Valentine's Day. On behalf of the Walter Burley Griffin Society, I would like to welcome everyone to the 2021 Marion Mahony Griffin lecture, titled "What Made Marion's Hair Stand on End?", to be presented by Dr. Anne Watson, curator of Paradise on Earth. But before I introduce Anne, I first would like to thank the Museum of Sydney for providing this wonderful Warren, isn't it? Warren venue for this special lecture, to follow by a visit to the exhibition. It's very much appreciated, and I thank you very, very much. Today, 100 years after the establishment of Castle Crag, we are celebrating 150 years since Marion Mahony Griffin's birth on the 14th of February, 1871 in Chicago. Architect, environmentalist, and visionary, Marion Mahony Griffin was a woman ahead of her time. Rayner Benham, one of the 20th century's most renowned architectural critics, once described Marion as America's, and perhaps the world's, first woman architect who needed no apology in a world of men. And on that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Anne Watson. Anne has an MA Fine Arts, a PhD Architecture from Sydney University. Her former career as architecture and design curator at the Powerhouse Museum included many exhibitions and publications with particular specializations in the work of Marion Mahony and Walter Burley Griffin, and, as important as well, the history of the Sydney Opera House. Anne was the curator, editor of the 1998 Powerhouse Museum Survey Exhibition and Catalogue, Beyond Architecture, Marion Mahony and Walter Burley Griffin in America, Australia, and India. In 2015, she was editor and contributing author of Visionaries in Suburbia, Griffin Houses in the Sydney Landscape, published by the Walter Burley Griffin Society, which includes comprehensive chapters on the Castle Crag houses, built and unbuilt. Nearly there, and since 2008, she's been an independent curator and writer and has published extensively on the Sydney Opera House, including the books Building a Masterpiece, the Sydney Opera House, and most recently, The Poisoned Chalice, Peter Hall and the Sydney Opera House. She's very good in titles. In her talk, What Made Marion's Hair Stand on End, Anne explores Marion Mahony Griffin pioneering work as an environmentalist and urban planning advocate in Australia. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Anne Watson.
Thanks, Aki. That was a lovely introduction. You could have just kept going. Yeah. My notes were right underneath. Well, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's enough to make one's hair stand on end. What made Marion's hair stand on end, I should say? Do I need to read it? It's enough to make one's hair stand on end, wrote Marion to Miles Franklin in January 1924. How determined the authorities are that nothing beautiful should be left in Sydney or anywhere else in this beautiful country. When Marion wrote to her friend, the renowned Australian author Miles Franklin, in early 1924, she'd been living in Australia for 10 years. Her frustration over Sydney's unsympathetic suburban development is palpable, and in Franklin she had a receptive audience. In 1924, building at Castle Crag, the Griffin's ideal suburb on the shores of Middle Harbour, was underway, but the model it proposed, a close-knit residential community living in harmony with the natural landscape, was proving to be a hard sell to Sydney's conservative home buyers, intent on finding domestic bliss under a pitched roof on a flat quarter-acre block. Marion and Miles had met 12 years earlier in Chicago when the author visited the Griffins after the announcement of their spectacular win in the Canberra competition. Reporting on the meeting for Sydney's Daily Telegraph in August 1912, Franklin and co-author Alice Henry were among the few writers to acknowledge Marion's significant role in the preparation of the Canberra plans. And the authors wrote, Mrs. Griffin is also an architect and is closely associated with her husband in his work. As they show their visitors designs of other undertakings upon which they have collaborated, it is plainly apparent their ideals are happily interwoven. Franklin describes Marion as slender and dark with luminous brown eyes, a lady of charming personality and nimble wit. The pair were clearly kindred spirits and became regular correspondents. Marion's indictment of the creeping obliteration of Sydney's natural beauty in 1924 was the first and would not be the last of her scathing criticisms of the spreading urban landscape. From their relocation to Australia in 1914, the Griffins appreciated and understood the significance of the country's unique plant life, both aesthetically, environmentally, and as a symbol of national identity. The day after their arrival, the Sydney Morning Herald paraphrased Walter's commentary on this subject. The article went, "Australia has the best decorative trees in the world." This is Walter speaking. "And if she had not, it would still be the duty of the people to make their parks and gardens as representative as possible of their own country. Australians should make the most of the good things of their own country and so inculcate in the minds of the young Australians a love for Australia and its native flora and fauna." Appreciating the post-Federation nationalist zeitgeist, the Griffins used their newly acquired public prominence to advocate for a national school of art. It would soon become a conduit for their environmental activism. In Sydney, it is likely they visited the Technological Museum in Ultimo that became the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, that became the Powerhouse Museum and is now back as the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, where the director, Richard Thomas Baker, had established displays devoted to the use of Australian flora and design, as well as galleries showcasing models and drawings of Australian plants and their commercial possibilities. In 1915, Walter wrote to Baker requesting a copy of his recently published Australian Flora in Applied Art, which you can see there. The book showcased a range of decorative arts incorporating Waratah motifs, as well as some of Lucien Henry's designs. Henry, who took part in the Paris Commune in 1871, was exiled to New Caledonia and ended up in Sydney in 1879. His stunning designs, intended for publication, were donated to the Technological Museum in 1911 and were championed by Baker in displays and lectures. The Griffins' exposure to and advocation of native plants on arrival in Australia was to become part of their broader environmental platform. But there is a nice little segue between Baker, the Griffins and Miles Franklin, and I'm going off on a bit of a detour here, so bear with me. In later life, Baker and Franklin became regular correspondents, bonding over their enthusiasm for the expression of national identity in art and culture. In 1940, they arranged to meet for the first time, Baker writing to Franklin that he would wear a Waratah leaf in his coat, "so that you can easily identify me," he wrote. At their afternoon tea, Baker presented Franklin with a Royal Doulton Waratah cup and saucer, now in the State Library collection. Franklin later wrote to a friend of the meeting, "The other friend was R.T. Baker. Go to the Adelaide Library and look up his book, Australian Flora in Applied Art. There was a pioneer, a little Englishman, who came out here and gave up high remuneration in one job to take a pittance so he could do research into Australian things. He was intoxicated with Australian flora, as were the Griffins who designed Canberra." In 1940, when this meeting occurred, Walter had died 3 years earlier in India, and Marion, approaching 70, had returned to Chicago. For Miles Franklin, however, their visionary legacy lived on, as it does to this day. How this legacy evolved in Marion's case is an inspirational story of one of the early 20th century's most original women. Marion Lucy Mahony was born, the second oldest of 5 children, on this very day 150 years ago in Chicago, just months before the Great Fire all but destroyed the city. The Mahony family subsequently moved north to the leafy village of Hubbard Woods, where Marion, who described it as the loveliest spot you could imagine, was encouraged to explore and develop her love of the natural environment, but also to experience the encroachment of suburbia over time. We children were educated by that greatest of teachers, Mother Nature, and in her loveliest mood, she would write in her unpublished autobiography, The Magic of America. Both Marion's parents were educators and progressive with progressive political, cultural and social ideas and many connections with activists and reformers. While a move back to Chicago in about 1880 meant that Marion lost her rural playground, it brought her into closer contact with this liberal-minded milieu, centred largely on her mother Clara after the death of her father in 1882. Both aspects of her upbringing would inform her adult life and professional career. Well, it's well known that Marion was the second woman to gain a professional degree in architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1894 and the first to pass the Illinois licensing exams. They are hugely significant achievements for a woman in late 19th century America and for anywhere, in fact. After graduating, she worked for a year in the architectural office of her cousin Dwight Perkins, and then, as is also well known, with Frank Lloyd Wright for almost 15 years. Her lively repartee with the boss, as he was called, has been documented by several male colleagues. But it is the architectural rendering style she initiated in the creative environment of Wright's studio that has sealed her place in the history of 20th century architecture. There's Wright and the Frank Lloyd Wright studio in Oak Park, which many of you I know have visited, and I've been there. It's great to go there. And when the pandemic's over, that's what you'll be able to do. We don't really have any or very little documentation as to what Marion's contribution was to the many projects of Wright's during this long period, 15 years. We do know that she designed the fireplace for the Dana House, which was sculpted by Richard Bock, a very talented American sculptor who did a lot of work for Wright, but it was also a very good friend of Marion's. And it's likely that she worked on the design of furniture and stained glass under Wright's direction, but of course none of his employees were ever directly credited for their contribution. So the Dana House was about 1902. By nearing the end of that first decade of the 20th century, Wright's prairie style had really been established and very well indicated in the Roby House, which is now part of the University of Chicago, I think, in South Chicago. In 1905, Frank Lloyd Wright travelled to Japan. He was totally bowled over by Japanese art and design and came back with a collection of Japanese prints. And of course showed them to his employees, including Marion, and they had a great impact on the rendering style that Marion developed, presumably under Wright's direction, but very much her own kind of style. On your left is the de Rhodes house. I love this drawing because it's one of the first that really acknowledges the influence of Japan, and it has a little inscription by Frank Lloyd Wright that says, drawn by Mahony after FLLW and Hiroshige. And interestingly, Marion has just snuck her MLM monogram in there as well. So, we're absolutely sure it's by her. And on the right is the Hardy House, which again shows, that very direct influence of Japan, a very, very daring rendering where, the houses, it's all sort of foreground, it's in that beautiful vertical Japanese style format. There's a little floral addition just there, which is also very Japanese. So Marion's beguiling melding of structure and landscape obviously got Wright's approval because it was continued in the 50 or so drawings we think Marion contributed to the 100 plates in Wright's seminal Ausgeführt Bauten und Entwurf von Frank Lloyd Wright, Buildings and Projects by Frank Lloyd Wright, that was published by Ernst Wasmuth in Berlin in 1910. And the Hardy House on the right was one of those plates. As well as that, there's the house. These were all included in the Wasmer folio, and I just included the Bock house because we know that that was drawn by Marion. Again, it's just overwhelmed by the vegetation, surrounding vegetation, trees and plants, and it's a really lovely little house. On the bottom is the fireproof house built of concrete that was shown in an article about Wright in the Ladies' Home Journal. And you can see that there's no monogram there, but this same drawing, but with the monogram, is included in the Wasmer folio. That's the only one I know of. That I was able... So basically Marion goes uncredited, but we know that she produced about 50%, as I said, of the plates for this incredibly important design folio. We know little about Marion's personal life while she was working for Wright. Walter Burley Griffin worked in Wright's studio from 1901 to 6, but there appears to have been no romantic involvement with Marion. In fact, apparently Walter was in love with Wright's sister. One wonders what Griffin, both architect and landscape architect, thought of Marion's very fine drawings with her obvious delight in depicting the natural world. We do know that Marion was very close to her cousin Dwight Perkins, for whom she worked briefly after graduating. A few years older than Marion, he was a fairly constant presence in both her childhood and early career. Perkins studied at MIT, as Marion did, and established a well-regarded practice in Chicago. He designed Steinway Hall in the mid-1890s, which you can see there, an 11-storey building on Van Buren Street, whose upper floors housed an enclave of like-minded artists and architects that included Griffin, Wright, Mahony and others in the late 1890s. But perhaps more significantly for Marion was her cousin's pioneering environmental activism, particularly the preservation of the natural landscape around Chicago in the face of spreading urbanisation. Perkins campaigned for years for the establishment of the Cook County Forest Preserve system, successfully made law in 1916, and around 1908 established the Prairie Club to facilitate guided walks to raise public awareness of the need for conservation strategies. Walter was a founding member of the club's committee, and it is likely Marion, at the very least, took part in the club's walks and environmental advocacy. I downloaded these images from the Prairie Club website. I couldn't find any that showed Marion or Walter or Dwight, but you have to sort of cast your mind back to about 1910 when these walks took place and how difficult it was for women with their hats and their long skirts and all the fences. And so I think they're quite quaint. Marion, noting that her cousin and Walter were founding members of the Prairie Club, wrote of it in The Magic of America, her autobiography that I mentioned. This was the organisation which interested rapidly increasing numbers to take long and ever longer hikes over the regions surrounding Chicago and later over the state, always under strict discipline to injure nothing and to pick not even a leaf, and under informed leaders to discover and inspect and select the beauty spots and to press for their resumption, for permanent public play spaces and beauty reserves. Thus, Chicago achieved the finest outer park system in the world. Well, Marion was also close to Perkins' wife, Lucy, a well-known artist and children's book author, and provided illustrations for several of her books around about 1908 to 10, so when she's still working for Wright. I love these. This is, I actually bought this book, ended up buying this book online, and we're fairly sure that Marion provided all the drawings that show, kind of scenes of nature, flora and fauna. And they're very different to Lucy's images, which are much more sort of conventional, but nice anyway. So I'm sure most of you know that Frank Lloyd Wright left his practice, fell in love with the wife of the client, Mama Borthwick Cheney, when he was designing a house for them. That's Marion's drawing up on the top left for the Cheney house, which you can still survives in Oak Park. And as a result of that, Mama and Frank went off together to Berlin in 1910 or at the end of 1909, when Frank was going over there to oversee the publication of his folio. And for Marion, it was a great scandal anyway, but for Marion, who was a particularly good friend of Frank Lloyd Wright's wife, Catherine, it was a terrible thing. Anyway, it's a tragic story that if you're interested in a kind of novelisation of it, you can read all about it in a book called Loving Frank. And there's another book about Frank's wives, various wives and partners, called The Women, which is also quite good. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright's departure in the company of Mama Borthwick Cheney from both his wife Catherine and his practice in late 1909 is a well-known turning point in his career. For Marion, it was also a significant pivot. Taking on some of Wright's undeveloped projects, she moved out of the Oak Park studio and back to Steinway Hall, where Walter, who had left Wright's office in 1906, had set up his own practice. With many interests and friends and colleagues in common, it was perhaps inevitable that they should work together. About 1910, Marion called on Walter to design the landscape scheme for Milliken Place, Decatur, a residential enclave she was designing. And what happened when Wright left, there were several projects that were still very much on the drawing board or hardly, commenced. And so Wright asked or commissioned a Chicago architect called Herman von Holst to sort of take over the practice. Von Holst then went to Marion, who, of course, was Wright's longest-serving employee at that stage, and asked her to take on some of the projects that he couldn't do. And the result was a number of very interesting houses. Milliken Place is particularly interesting. There were 3 houses, one of which was the Irving House, which you can see here. So this is around about 1910. And I think that Marion designed the very interesting furniture for the house as well, although it survives in the collection of the Milwaukee Art Museum and is credited to somebody else, a man called George Niederken. Even though in Magic of America, Mahony does state that she was responsible for the design, so something that she rarely did. Another house that was part of this Milliken Place enclave was the Adolf Müller house. And it's interesting to see, just talking about von Holst, this is Marion's drawing for the house. Just there, she scratched out von Holst's name and put her own name in. Good for her. About this time, Marion produced her first presentation rendering. And I should say that Marion called on Walter to design the landscape scheme for Milliken Place. So, they're sort of getting together. About this time, Marion produced her first presentation rendering for a project by Walter, the composition of the Marshall House drawing, combining perspective, site plan, and interior cross-section, all framed by decorative foliage in a vertical format, established the unique presentation arrangement for many of their subsequent American projects. And just a couple here, I'm sure you're all familiar with these beautiful drawings, ink on linen. Again, using nature, foliage, vegetation to, frame the houses. Very, very beautifully done. And these are all in the Bloch Museum of Art in Northwestern University, just north of Chicago. Wonderful collection. And such a shame that we couldn't borrow any for the exhibition, because of course it would have required couriers coming out, and that was just impossible last year and this year and who knows when. Meanwhile, Marion and Walter's mutual passion for the natural environment seems to have been mutating into a different kind of passion for each other. I was swept off my feet, reminisced Marion, by delight in his achievements in my profession, then through a common bond of interests in nature and intellectual pursuits, and then with the man himself. It was by no means love at first sight, but it was a madness when it struck. Woo. About this time, they brought a canoe, which they christened the Alana, and they spent weekends exploring the Chicago River and its tributaries in order, in Marion's words, to rediscover domains in the same pristine state of loveliness as in centuries gone by. I couldn't find any photos of them in their Alana canoe. Marion writes a lot about these weekend excursions in The Magic of America, but I just downloaded some stills from the beautiful Middle Harbour film that was made by the Griffins to promote Castle Craig in 1927. So here they are in their canoes, canoeing on Middle Harbour, so you'd sort of get the picture. However, their paddling trips also revealed the destructive effects of Chicago's rapid industrialisation on this pristine environment. Marion wrote of one excursion canoeing down the Calumet River to Lake Michigan. From the wonder and perfection of the natural stream, we passed to town after town in this industrial region, incredibly sordid, with the waters thick with the poisonous byproducts of the mills. Where it would have been the easiest thing in the world to have kept the river and its banks as permanent playgrounds for the growing communities. Was ever any civilisation so stupid, so barbarous? And this is a postcard. Why anyone would make a postcard of this scene, I do not know. So it's around about 1907, a little bit before they went paddling down the Calumet River. But as you can see, it's pretty horrific. Significantly, perhaps, it was on one of these excursions in the summer of 1911 that Marion and Walter got out of their canoe, walked into the courthouse in Michigan City, Indiana, at the bottom of Lake Michigan, and got married. And just incidentally, nearby the courthouse in Michigan City is the Indiana Dunes, which were a favoured excursion spot for the Prairie Club and no doubt familiar to Walter and Marion. And in the 1920s, as a result of the club's efforts, the area was declared a state park and I believe still is. As well as canoeing, Marion and Walter spent some time exploring the undeveloped countryside around the Chicago, Lake Michigan area. I love this photo on the left. It shows Marion in the middle and then Walter to her left. On the right is Marion's sister-in-law. And, you know, they're sort of hamming it up for the camera, presumably. On the right, I'm not sure where this is, but it's a great photo, I think, of presumably they're on a walking tour with this group. Walter in his little sort of trilby hat and on one side, and then Marion right over on the left in the group of women with the kind of turban headdresses and the more conservative headwear is on the other side, and particularly the one with the feathers. It's just extraordinary how impractical their clothes were. Well, Walter's activities as a practitioner of the then nascent profession of landscape architecture brought him into the ambit of a number of related scientific disciplines, including botany, geology, horticulture, plant ecology, and the interrelationship between plant life, environment, and climate. Marion relished the challenge of understanding new disciplines, and what she learnt from Walter on those numerous canoe and field trips about the ecological interconnectedness of the natural world would inform her environmentalism for the rest of her life. Soon after Marion and Walter set up their professional collaboration in 1910, Marion was approached by Joshua Melson, who, with a partner, had recently purchased a large tract of land near Mason City, Iowa. Ironically, Melson had first approached Wright to design his house and other houses in the development, but Melson wanted more than just a house to set by the roadside, as Marion described it. And on the right is the design that Wright, he didn't actually design it for Melson, he designed it for somebody else, but he offered it to Melson. Melson didn't want it. The house that Marion and Walter designed for Melson was like no other, and very unlike Wright's, as you can see. And apparently Melson loved it. Indeed, the whole development was a chance for the Griffins to combine their talents and interests over the next 2 years, that is, environmental, town planning and architectural. There's Marion's beautiful drawing of the Melson house. I know some of you have been to it. I think its current owners were the people who restored it over the past 5, and they're looking after it beautifully. On the 7-hectare property, bisected by Willow Creek, the Griffins sited 19 houses that largely retained and blended with the variable topographical conditions of the challenging site. Marion's superb aerial perspective shows the intended residences in a leafy environment, maximising views, privacy, architectural individuality and the retention and rehabilitation of the natural landscape. Rock Crest, Rock Glen was a brilliant integrated expression of Marion and Walter's urban planning and environmental principles. When Marion despaired of the destruction of Sydney's natural beauty in her letter to Miles Franklin in 1924, she would no doubt have been thinking of the ideas embodied in the Mason City project as a remedy for Sydney's suburban horrors. They were ideas that, on a grander scale, informed the Canberra plans completed in 1911, while Rockcrest was developing, and of course Castle Crag a decade or so later. As at Rockcrest, the Canberra site's natural features dictated the city's plan, which also expressed symbolically the Griffins' democratic ideal for the new capital. Significantly, and perhaps recalling the horrors of Lake Michigan's industrial blight, the plan allowed for plentiful parks and recreation spaces, particularly around the shores of the man-made lake, which in the Griffin plan was free of residential developments, unlike today. It was the Canberra project that brought Marion and Walter to Australia in May 1914. Their enthusiastic response to the Indigenous flora was immediate and stimulated a broader interest in Australia's unique natural environment. Christopher Vernon, one of my a Griffin scholar, in his 1997 essay, A Legitimate Art Distinctive of Australia and Australia Alone, has pointed out that in August 1914, Marion and Walter attended sessions of the 84th meeting of the British Association of the Advancement of Science, with its many overseas delegates, as well as papers on Australian botany, climate, geography and geology. And of course, this is just after they've arrived in Australia from Chicago. This important conference, described as a scientific picnic, opened in Adelaide on the 8th of August 1914, 4 days after the declaration of World War I, and thence moved to Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. As well as the knowledge gained, it would have provided Marion and Walter with introductions to some of the country's leading botanists and other scientific professionals. For the Griffins, it was a timely opportunity to immerse themselves in the natural sciences of this ancient and intriguing country. Perhaps as a result of connections made at the conference, Marion and Walter joined the Naturalist Society of New South Wales at about the same time. Membership facilitated contact with professionals in the natural sciences and, most importantly, excursions into the local bushland. And Marion wrote quite extensively of these excursions in The Magic of America. I'm assuming you all know what The Magic of America is. It was in a sort of assemblage, 8 volumes in fact, of typescripts and photographs and letters that Marion compiled, we think probably in the 1940s after she went back to America. So it's about her life, but also about her life with Walter. Fortunately, about a decade or so ago, it was digitised. So it's now, you can now explore it in its entirety online. Anyway, Marion wrote in The Magic of America, Saturday was always kept free for those walks in the outlying districts of Sydney, anything up to 20 miles, with Miss Leplastrier, the botanist, identifying trees and shrubs and flowers. By the end of the year, he, that is Walter, knew more than anyone in Australia of what was significant of a landscape what was significant for a landscape architect, and could recognise plants more accurately from near or far away. Only the Aboriginals could beat him at that. Well, Walter may have been very knowledgeable, but as was soon evident, so was Marion. And all the way through Magic of America, she reveres Walter and defers to him all the time, never sort of promoting her own work. So, on the very odd occasions when she does do this, as with the Adolf Mueller furniture that I showed you, that it's likely that she was responsible. One of the catalysts for the Griffin scientific interest in Australian flora at this time was their plan to include native plantings in the Canberra landscaping. But for Marion, the exercise inspired a more cerebral project, an extensive listing of plants, Indigenous and exotic. She wrote, as for me, I spent much time for several years, this is about 1916 to 17, in listing plants and all details concerning them in tabulated form for use in any and all planting schemes, as tabulated to show different growth requirements as soil, moisture and so on, heights and shapes of growth, colour of flowers, foliage, berries and barks. There were those who thought it might have become a work of national importance. And these catalogues have survived in the Nichols collection in the National Library, and earlier last year I was able to look through them. They're beautiful things, and presumably the bindings were designed and made by Marion. But it's interesting that she doesn't just include native plants, also includes exotic species as well. So they were both hugely knowledgeable about the plant world. Alas, the planting schemes for Canberra would never be realised, but Marion's plant catalogues undoubtedly supplied a valuable reference source for the landscape scheme for Newman College in Melbourne, produced about 1917. Here, as Marion records, Australian trees and shrubs were to be planted in ensembles according to habit of growth, colour and time of blossoming, so that there will be always some section which is in attractive bloom. In Melbourne, where they lived from 1915 to 1925, the Griffins practised what they preached, literally in their own backyard. And one of my favourite photos is of them gardening, Marion in her practical caftan, outside their minimal one-room home that they call Foliota in Heidelberg. And just bear with me, another lovely quote from Marion, writing of Foliota. It nestled far back on its allotment, under the spreading branches of two giant gums, and was so lovely in the midst of its ever-blooming garden that Mr. G and I used to walk backward every morning as we went off to the office, so as to delight our hungry eyes as long as possible. Well, it's interesting to contrast Marion's delight in their native garden with her criticism of the Australian fondness for unsuitable exotic plantings. And she wrote, in Australia, almost all the residential gardening consists of completely destroying all the natural growth and then putting in European plants, the consequence of which is, no matter how beautiful a garden might be when made, sooner or later it entirely disappears, for such plantings require constant attention, without which they cannot last through the long, dry seasons. So that, on the whole, the towns and suburbs are barren deserts compared with what we are accustomed to in America. Marion, of course, this is, almost a century ago that she wrote this, and she could not have foreseen how relevant her environmentally rational approach to landscaping would be a century later, as a warming climate and decreasing rainfall dictate more pragmatic garden schemes, or no gardens at all. Choosing plants according to their suitability to the topography, climate and soil type, as well as their aesthetic attributes, is a lesson we are being forced to embrace as we grapple with changing weather patterns. Well, while Marion was compiling her plant catalogues in 1916, she was also designing the interiors of the new Cafe Australia in Melbourne's Collins Street, a tour de force that integrated her sophisticated and daring design ideas and her enthusiasm for the decorative possibilities of natural motifs. In the cafe, nature, both abstracted and real, became a unifying theme. Although typically contemporary accounts credited the work to Mr. Griffin alone, extensive documentation suggests that Marion was the main designer. Walter at this time battling the bureaucrats over the implementation of the Canberra plans. The completely remodelled interiors consisted of 5 ground floor dining spaces, including a fern room, fountain, court, banquet hall with an upper balcony beneath a great vaulted ceiling of open plaster tracery, letting in natural light from the light well above. Extraordinary photo on the left with that sort of beam of light from heaven shining onto the floor. Backlit stained glass ceilings, indirect concealed wall lighting, and spectacular standard lights on the upper balcony provided additional illumination. Well, black and white photographs don't do it justice, and bear with me, here's a quote from a contemporary newspaper account. And the journalist writes, "Onto the fern room, the ceiling lights a continuation of the fountain court, but enriched with angular patterns of greens in geometric leaf form. Again, no division of petitions, but piers only of gold Delft tile, enclosing 4 pools for goldfish, with fountain spray lighted by a clever device, throwing ever-varying prismatic lights, glowing in the water and reflecting in the gold tile, the whole set in boxes of growing flowers and surrounded by greenery. To one side of these rooms is the grand staircase leading to the balcony or the dining hall. Here the motifs of the piers are used for newel posts surmounted by great bowls of palms and flowers and drooping vines." Take that, Justin Hems. As in America and their first year in Sydney, the Griffins used every opportunity their busy Melbourne practice allowed to explore the Victorian bush. And there are lots of photographs in the Nichols collection in the National Library that they took of these trips into what looks to be fairly impassable country. And first of all, on the right is Marion with this kind of turbine thing that she likes to wear. But on the left, I noticed as I looked closely at the photo that there was something happening in the centre, so I blew it up. But I think that's Walter. I can see his hat, the sort of trilby hat that he loved wearing. But there he is. Marion's presumably taking a photo, and they're travelling by horse and cart. So it's extraordinary to think that apart from the constraints of what they wore, they were constrained by how far they could get without resorting to walking. In 1918, Marion made her first trip to Tasmania, this time without Walter, but with 2 companions. One of them was the Melbourne artist Bertha Murfield, who Marion had commissioned to paint the mural drawn in the Australian bush that was the focal point of the Cafe Australia's assemblage of dramatic rooms. Marion later wrote that the trip was specifically, and I quote, "to make drawings of the fascinating trees to be found if only one can get away from the habitations of man. We had a wonderful fortnight, which enabled me to add a number of unique trees to my set of forest portraits." There's Bertha's wonderful mural that was in the Cafe Australia. The cafe was demolished in the late 1930s, sadly, Wouldn't it have been wonderful to be able to go there today and have mock turtle soup and those things they used to eat? And there's Marion on the left, this with her two companions on their Tasmanian trip, sketching trip. In the middle is Bertha, and on the right is a poet, Mabel Hookey, who Marion had quite a nasty verbal exchange with about the Indigenous population. I won't go into that. In fact, Marion visited Tasmania for over a month during the Christmas period, and on the 27th of December, she sent a postcard to Walter. "Beloved," she started, it's Valentine's Day, "think the money for this trip might be well spent if I could stay long enough to make a dozen tree drawings. Have one in pretty good shape and 2 others in hand, just in pencil, but enough to work from." Well as drawing en plein air, Marion took copious photographs during the trip, perhaps working from these back in the studio in Melbourne. This is one of my favourites, tree ferns. Neither conventional botanical illustrations nor purely artistic interpretations, the forest portraits are Marion's unique and eloquent response to Tasmania's magnificent plant life in its natural environment. The significance she attached to the portraits is underlined by the inclusion of photos of 24 of them in The Magic of America, accompanied by Marion's own evocative and lyrical descriptions. Marion produced the portraits generally as ink on linen studies, followed by coloured inks and dyes on silk. Unfortunately for most of us, for us, that most of the silk forest portraits are in US collections and very difficult to, private collections I might add, and quite difficult to borrow. And of course we couldn't borrow for the exhibition anyway. Many of the forest portraits are from the 1918 to 19 Tasmanian trip, but she also produced studies of trees observed in New South Wales and Victoria. So in the middle is, on the left is the photograph that she or Walter took. No, she took, because Walter wasn't there. In the middle is a page from The Magic of America, and on the right is the finished forest portrait, tree ferns on silk. And in Magic of America, she wrote almost transcendentally of this particular drawing: "To walk entranced down the long aisle, flanked by great golden brown columns, eyes lifted to dwell on the open lacework fretted vault, through graceful fern fronds to blue sky, to walk, to stand, to listen." And of this one, Eucalyptus ernigera, she wrote, "Seeing this tree at sunset, I could not resist painting it so, but the colour is there in the bark and no reflection of the sun's glow. The angel who painted Australia was the greatest artist of them all." And this one I love, Banksia marginata. It's another Tasmanian Banksia, but she also produced sort of half architectural renderings, half forest portraits. She called it a forest portrait anyway, in Castle Craig. And this one I love. It shows the fabulous Angophora. Sadly, this is known only from a photograph in the Nichols collection. Presumably the silk version of it disappeared. Well, before her trip to Tasmania, Marion presented a lecture titled "Community Planning and Planting" to the Women Horticulturalists Association of Victoria. The talk was reported in the Australasian, and I quote it at length because it encapsulates the holistic philosophies both Marion and Walter spent their careers promoting. And the journalist wrote, "Mrs. Griffin emphasised the desirability of horticulturalists and architects working together so that proper consideration could be given to the location of buildings in relation to a garden scheme. She emphasised the beauties of native Australian flora and the very great desirability of using more, at least 9/10 of native flora to 1/10 of foreign material. Not only can the maximum beauty be obtained in this way, but it will be attained in the shortest time and the least expenditure." Her talk was illustrated by drawings showing the grouping of buildings and the massing of plantings, emphasising the advantage of working together in our communities instead of following the present custom of leaving each individual to determine his element of the common problem. Community gardening took us another century to catch up, and it hasn't really caught on yet anyway. It's a pivotal quote because here is Marion 4 years after her arrival in Australia advocating not just for the use of native plants in gardening but also for the concept of coordinated community landscape and garden schemes and presumably their maintenance, as well as the sightings of buildings, an integrated approach to urban design that was soon to be pursued in the Griffin's Castle Crag venture, Marion's Paradise on Earth. I'll just run, I'm probably going right over time. Are we going? Castle Crag, I'm sure many of you have been there. With Canberra sort of falling apart for the both of them, the Griffins set up the GSDA, Greater Sydney Development Association, to purchase 263 hectares of land on Middle Harbour. The first land was sold in November 1921, so there's a wonderful centenary coming up in November, and I'm sure the Griffin Society is planning lots of things for then. So we know quite a bit about the development of Castle Crag, the first houses that were actually built for GSDA use in Edinburgh Road. What it looked like when the Griffins purchased the land, and of course being close to Edinburgh Road and at the top of the rise was accessible to anyone and everyone who wanted to get in there and gather firewood and wildflowers and whatever. So when the Griffins bought the land, it was pretty denuded, and of course they set about rehabilitating it. And of course they planned for reserves and walkways that interconnected with each other. The roads were contoured to follow the natural topography, all things that were pretty special to Castle Crag and really still are. Just a few of the houses. This is the Cheong House in the Parapet, built in 1922. And one of the few watercolours on silk by Marion of an Australian project that survived. This is again in the National Library. But you can see the letters Cove and Crag that have been imprinted onto the drawing. And we think that that's because this is the Griffin's office in Bligh Street, so just around the corner in the city. And above the entryway there was, you may not be able to see it in the photo, but there was a sort of display case where these drawings were shown. And at some stage it looks as though the effects of light have sort of stencilled the printing onto the lower and upper borders of the drawing. Just a little bit of trivia, really. There were many, many designs for unbuilt houses, about 50 in fact, and we reproduced quite a few of them in Visionaries in Suburbia. I love this one. This is a house for Madame Eva Wolf-Carius. And as you can see, it's L-shaped with a kind of roof garden. It's a wonderful design, and she sounds as though she was a wonderful, slightly eccentric person. She lived in the Astor in Macquarie Street. From 1925, the Griffins lived in the Grant House, also in the Parapet, and we've got a fabulous interior view down the bottom. But also from Magic of America, Marion included these photos of she and Walter and two other friends dressed up to go to, I think it's to a Mexican night that was held in a club that they frequented in the city called Packy's. And it's likely that Marion made these costumes, and that's Walter on the right. So they had a lot of fun. Community was very important for Marion in Castle Crag, and these are stills again from the film Beautiful Middle Harbour. Just shows Marion in the actual film, moving around and serving tea to her guests. But you can see 1927, she's had her hair bobbed, so she's right up with the latest fashion. She made her own clothes, so it's likely she made that wonderful sort of coat outfit. And I think just really sort of says what Castle Crag was about. Community, there are lots of photographs in the Nichols collection of community events, parties for children. Children were, of course, encouraged to roam free, and they roamed in and out of people's houses. Marion used to leave bowls of fruit around so they could just come and help themselves. You can see Marion and Walter. Oops, oh, I'll do it back. In the centre, just there, seated on the grass. And here's Walter with one of the Castle Crag residents, Ula Maddox, and her daughter, Deirdre. I love that photo, very kind of relaxed. And the Haven Theatre, built out of a sort of natural amphitheatre by the residents in the early 1930s, where plays were staged, usually by Marion, who was a bit of a thespian, and they used, in the absence of theatre lighting, they apparently used car headlights. So a very different sort of theatrical experience, but if you ever get a chance to just sit quietly in the Haven Theatre, it's a lovely thing to do. And of course, unfortunately, under some threat at the moment to have it sort of modernised and made suitable for wheelchair access, which is a great thing, but, it gives it a whole other sort of perspective. And a huge collection of photographs that Adrian Cabos found when we were putting together the Visionaries book of Herman Junger's photographs. He was a resident in the Moa House in Castle Crag in the early 1930s. And there he is with his fold-up canoe and picnic, and with his family outside the Moa House. Well, for Marion, the integration and interconnectedness of landscape, community and architecture were fulfilled at Castle Crag. They were visionary ideals that would, alas, fall victim to the Depression, Walter's untimely death in early 1937, and the unprofitable economics of such generous land use in a city fast becoming an increasingly desirable place to live, even then. Well, I don't live in Castle Crag, but I do live in an area with some wonderful bush, where I regularly walk my dog. There she is. And my favourite Angophora. I'm not going to tell you where this is. Before Christmas, I was on one of my regular rambles. The Christmas bush was glorious, but more extraordinary was the one lone Christmas bell I spotted amongst some flannel flowers. I'd never seen one in this reserve before, but with things Marion on my mind, it immediately resonated and reminded me of another letter she wrote to Miles Franklin on Christmas Eve, 1929. I quote it in full, firstly because it's a nice bookend to the Franklin letter that introduced this talk, but also because it neatly sums up Marion and Walter's reverence for the sanctity of nature. She wrote, to Miles Franklin, Castle Crag has concentrated for the past week on safeguarding the bush. We have all been taking turnabout at being out at 4 a.m, those were the days, and late evening, though Walt has been on duty just about all the time. We think our dozen rangers on duty have made a decided difference in the stripping of the 3 promontories of Christmas bush and bells, though some rascals have slipped through our fingers. Why don't you write an article for the press suggesting that Australians, instead of destroying the glory of the bush, make a religious ceremony of going out to see the Christmas bush in its prime and establish festivals for its worship? A good religion that would be. Hear, hear, Marion, I'm with you. Well, the lone Christmas bell experience made me appreciate Marion's and indeed Walter's almost mystical connection with nature and their frustrating struggle to communicate their philosophies to a largely Philistine and fairly apathetic Sydney public. It was surely one of the reasons Marion in the late 1920s turned to anthroposophy, the movement founded by Rudolf Steiner in about 1912. Anthroposophy's central philosophy, an aspiration to self-knowledge through an understanding of the interconnectedness of the natural, material and spiritual worlds, clearly resonated with the Griffins' own ideas and lifestyle. Regard for the environment and the redemptive power of the natural world had always been a part of their ethos, and in Steiner they encountered a kindred spirit. Decades ahead of his time, Steiner advocated the practice of organic agriculture, or biodynamics, as a solution to the depredations of chemical fertilisers and overcropping. And it's interesting that there's an article on this very subject, sustainable farming, in the Herald this weekend. Somewhat presciently, Marion wrote in The Magic of America of the problem faced by modern agricultural methods. This is the last quote. Scarcely a week passes without an article about the serious condition of the soil, about blights of the products and the diseases of the animals fed from the large quantity production methods attained by chemical fertilisers and other materialistic scientific methods, some of which are denuding the districts, some creating growing deserts whose dry sands are sweeping on. And well, that's almost a century ago. On that sober note, what made Marion's hair stand on end in 1924 would probably give her a heart attack now. Depressingly, we seem to have learnt nothing over the last 100 years. Sure, we live in a different world. There are a lot more of us. We want bigger houses, bigger cars, more of everything. We want minimal gardens that require no maintenance, not messy nature that we can't control. As for trees, they are view blockers, leaf droppers and space consumers. Chop them down. Our houses occupy every legal inch of a block of land. We can do so much better. And in fact now we have to, because the incontrovertible effects of human-induced global warming are upon us. We need to change how we think about our place on the earth, to think like Marion and Walter a century ago, to revere and preserve nature, not to see it as a commodity to be tamed, to consume much less, to change our focus from ourselves to our connectedness to each other and to the natural world. The visionary ideas that the Griffins, both Marion and Walter, expressed and that propelled their lives a century ago are even more relevant today. This is their great legacy. Happy birthday, Marion.
So on behalf of the Walter Griffin Society, I'd like to thank Anne for her absolutely immersive experience in the life and the wonderful career of Marion. So informative, visually stimulating, and I'm sure we all learnt an awful lot. So absolutely delightful. So perhaps we can give Anne another round of applause. There are some wonderful activities forthcoming. I might point out that the first one this afternoon at 2 p.m, the Castle Crag Progress Association birthday bash street party has been cancelled for COVID reasons. But if you look down on page 2, down the bottom, there's especially the Max Japan online exhibition, the Griffin open houses in the 2nd of May, so tickets will be available for that in March, and there will be an outdoor Max Japan and other photographers' work mounted in locations around Castle Crag that will coincide with the open houses but extend for a few more days after that. As well, the Walter Griffin Society is commissioned a sculpture to honour Marion to be erected in a new pocket park, which replaces a tiny car park outside the Griffin Centre in the shopping centre of Castle Crag, and we are trying to raise funds towards that. So if you go to the Griffin Society website, there's an opportunity for you to make a donation if you haven't already done so. And as well, the book that Anne so capably edited, right, is on sale in the bookshop. And I might also put a plug for a friend, Glenda, who also delivered a talk on Marion in Canberra last night, which is online, and I presume Anne's talk will be available online too. Glenda returned from Canberra last night and is here today, and her book is on Marion, is also on sale in the bookshop here. So if anyone has now thought of some questions, now would be the time. Otherwise, we will finish the festivities and we hope you go back and enjoy the exhibition.
I just want to thank everyone for coming and the Griffin Society for organising this, and to thank Jeff up in the bio box. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?